Okay, good evening, everybody. I would first like to acknowledge and pay respect to the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, the Ngunnawal people. It is upon their ancestral lands that the Australian Academy of Science is built, and as we share in our knowledge, teaching, research practices and learnings, may we also pay respect to the knowledge embedded forever within the Aboriginal custodianship of country. Well, the fifth of these The Science of Us sessions has arrived, and I'd like to wish you all welcome, and we've got a fantastic couple of speakers for you here tonight. My name is Professor Simon Foote, and I'm one of the conveners for this series along with Professor Lois Salmonson. I'm thrilled to be here in this iconic Shine Dome once again, and I look forward to having some research experiences from our speakers shared with us tonight, and I think we're in for quite a treat. However, before we go any further, I would just like to say that we do actually have hearing assistants in this hall, and as usual, if you can't hear me, then you should go and get these turned on. There's a bit of a catch-22 there. Please see staff at the registration desk if this is a problem. So, as you know, this series has taken us on a journey through our lives from conception, development, childhood, adulthood, all the way through to death, or not quite at death yet. Tonight we are here to discuss issues that appear in the twilight of our lives, and that is the ageing process, the ageing of our brains and our bodies. And we invite you to join us on this conversation on Twitter at the hashtag #ScienceOfUs, one word. So first, I would now like to introduce tonight's first speaker, Professor Bronwyn Kingwell. Bronwyn is an NHMRC Senior Principal Research Fellow, that's the very top of the tree, Head of the Translational Research Domain and the Metabolic and Vascular Physiology Laboratory at the Baker Heart and Diabetes Institute in Melbourne. Bronwyn's early research was in the area of exercise, metabolic and circulatory regulation, where she performed landmark studies, including the first credible clinical trial that demonstrated that walking reduces cardiovascular risk. Please join me in welcoming Bronwyn.
Okay, so thanks very much, Simon. Pleased to see that we've got a full house tonight, and I think that probably reflects the relatability of this topic, unfortunately. As Simon said, I'm from Melbourne's Baker Heart and Diabetes Institute, where we study some of the most common age-related diseases, so cardiovascular disease, that's heart attack and stroke, and of course diabetes, which is a bit of an epidemic at the moment associated with our ageing population and also with obesity. So it's all a bit doom and gloom. I'll discuss what happens to the underlying organ systems that contribute to these diseases, but I want to spend at least half the talk discussing ways that we can mitigate these effects of ageing, and I want to focus on one particular strategy which I can guarantee you will actually work. So let's start with the superficial signs of ageing. This is what we see when we look in the mirror. There's the gradual greying of their hair, thank God for hair dye. There's the baldness that occurs, of course, in the blokes, or some of you, and the women, we get a little bit of thinning as well. And then, of course, there's the loss of skin elasticity and the wrinkles and so forth. This is what's happening on the outside, and I want to dig a little deeper tonight. But before I do, this abstract caught my eye at the recent European Society of Cardiology meeting in Munich a couple of months ago when I was attending. This was the abstract of the day that was highlighted in the scientific papers, and it was a relationship between some of the signs of physical ageing on the outside and cardiovascular death. It was a study that was conducted in France, of course, where they're a bit obsessed with skin. And what you can see in this study is that in 3,000 or so individuals, a relationship between the depth of forehead wrinkles and cardiovascular death. And this was independent of chronological ageing. There's various physiological reasons that might underpin this related to effects on, structural proteins and blood flow and so forth. But today we'll dig down a little bit further into some more scientific ways of measuring ageing and some of, not just the superficial effects, but some of the functional effects. Yes, certainly. And please tell me if you can't hear me. Is that better? A little? Yeah, okay, and I'll speak up as well. All right, so digging down a little bit more into some of the functional effects of ageing, and I thought I'd take a personal perspective to begin with now that I'm the wrong side of 50. So what I've noticed recently is when I go to the gym, I can do fewer chin-ups. I used to be able to do proper boy chin-ups. I could do 10 or 12. Now I'm down to about 4, and if I try to do any more, the muscles pull, the joints don't work anymore. So, there's musculoskeletal things happening there. Jumping hurts. Simon, you'll relate to this one. I think I'll need my knees done at some stage. So that's muscle, that's joints, that's tendons. And I just wanted to prove to you that I could once jump, because this is me back 25 years ago when I moonlighted for Rebel Sport as their exercise physiologist. Postdoctoral fellowships don't pay very well. So these were my health tips, and there's me. I'm jumping over the Spirit of Tasmania. This was at Port Melbourne Beach. So can't do that anymore. The other thing that's been concerning is in the morning, not so much in the afternoon, but in the morning when I try to put my socks on, I can't balance. Does anyone else have that? You have to sit down. So again, that's the combination of the muscles, the tendons, the joints. But the thing that's really difficult for me to take is this: I can't run as far or as fast, and my 11-year-old daughter in the last year can now beat me both in a 100-metre sprint and also in a 3-kilometre distance event, which she's very excited about, but now I can see it's all downhill for me, and it's just going to be a scissor graph going like this. So what's happening? What's happening to our bodies that cause these declines, and how do they relate to the chronic diseases that ultimately relate to the major causes of morbidity and mortality? Well, these are the organ systems we're going to focus on tonight. I'm going to focus over on the left-hand side and talk about the heart and the blood vessels, and a little bit about the muscles, not so much about the other related organ systems, the tendons, joints and nerves, but they're also very important in how muscles function, of course. And so I'll be over here, and Kaarin will talk about the brain. And as I said, these are the organ systems that underpin a lot of the major chronic disease, heart attack and stroke, ischemic heart disease being our major cause of death in Australia, diabetes related to aspects of muscle function, type 2 diabetes that is, and dementia, of course, being very important. You'll hear about that from Kaarin. So let's get a bit more scientific than forehead wrinkles and talk about how we can measure ageing, particularly as it relates to these systems. And I'm particularly interested in measures that relate and are predictive of long-term quality of life and also longevity. And it turns out you can measure this relatively simply using a test called a maximum oxygen consumption test, or a VO2 max test. Some of you may have done a version of this test in the gym. Others may have had a version of it as a diagnostic for ischemic heart disease. But the version that we do to measure measure fitness really, which relates to longevity, involves a test on a bike or a treadmill. Goes for about 10 minutes, it goes to exhaustion, so the resistance on the bike pedals ramps up over that 10 minutes, and you can see there's a mask here that allows us to measure the oxygen that this individual can extract from air at maximum exercise. So let me talk you through what that's actually measuring. It's a very integrated determinant of body function, because this is what it's measuring. It's measuring oxygen coming in from the air. It's measuring the ability of the lungs to get that oxygen into the blood vessels through these little alveolar sacs that are contained in the lungs. It looks at the ability of the blood to extract that oxygen, the little black dots here, into the haemoglobin in your red blood cells. The ability of the heart to distribute that throughout the body via the vascular system here. And also the ability of that oxygen to get into muscle and into the mitochondria, these little factories here that produce energy. So it's a measure of muscle function. So you can see why that single measure is a really integrated measure of body function. And here are some data looking at the relationship between that measure and longevity. So this is a large study in around 5,000 individuals, and they've been divided into 4 levels of VO2 max or fitness levels. So those that are below the lower limit of normal are shown in red, and this is looking at all-cause mortality here over a 46-year follow-up. So this group with the lowest VO2 max has the highest all-cause mortality over that time period. And conversely, those with the highest VO2 max here have the lowest all-cause mortality, and these are intermediate levels here. So a very strong relationship and a very strong predictive relationship of this measure with longevity. And this is what happens to that measure with ageing, unfortunately. So this is males from age around 10 up to 80, and this is what happens to VO2 max as we age, and this is for women. Slight difference between men and women. That's primarily a result of males having a higher muscle mass or a higher lean body mass. If we actually normalise these data to muscle mass or lean body mass, the lines would pretty much overlap. So this is why my 11-year-old is starting to beat me over 3K. She's down here on the curve. I'm up here somewhere, won't tell you exactly where, but somewhere up here, further along than I'd like to be. And you can see the very strong relationship between endurance time and VO2 max, again in males and females in relation to age. So again, daughter up here, me down here. I don't know what happens after this bit. Okay, so endurance time and ageing. What are the main determinants of this maximum oxygen consumption? We talked about it in broad terms with this diagram, but what I want to point out to you is that unless you're a smoker or have emphysema, it's these measures here. It's the heart and vascular function and the muscle function, which are the main determinants of maximum oxygen consumption. So I want to drill down a little bit into what happens to these organs when we age. So this is some of the measures we make in our lab. This is an MRI machine. Anyone had an MRI? Yeah, awful, aren't they? Claustrophobic, horrible. Imagine having the MRI but also being asked to exercise while you're inside the MRI. Can you see that? Can you see the pedals going around there? So we're asking someone to do a VO2 max test while they're in an MRI, and we image the heart at the same time. So you can see the main chamber of the heart there pumping away. It's different views of the heart. And we can make various measures of heart function. And one of the most important measures is how much blood the heart can pump out at maximal exercise. That's one of the very strong determinants of VO2 max, as you can imagine, because that's a determinant of how much oxygen gets out to your muscles. And making these measurements during exercise can uncover a lot of pathologies that we don't see at rest. The heart can function quite well at rest when there's not a high demand for oxygen, but during exercise that's when we can see whether it can really cope and whether there are issues with both the filling of the heart and its ability to contract. So what happens to the heart when we age? So if these are just diagrams here or schematics of the heart. This is a young normal heart compared to an older or an ageing heart. And the two main things I want to point out, and it's quite obvious here, is that there's this thickening of the walls of the heart here. A lot of that occurs in response to high blood pressure. The heart's a muscle, and like any muscle, if it has to push against a higher load, it hypertrophies and thickens, but not in a good way here. And the other thing that happens is that the tissue here fibroses, so a lot of collagen's deposited in the walls of the heart. And what that means is the heart becomes stiff and non-compliant. So when blood is returning to the heart after it's been around the body and it enters the heart can't expand and basically the volume of the heart is reduced. And that means that when the heart goes to contract, there's less blood for distribution around the body. So you can see here at a diagrammatic, microscopic level, looking at the cells, there are these myofibroblast cells here between the muscle cells that are secreting collagen. You're getting deposition of very stiff collagen within these muscle cells. And on this histology slide, you can see, again, deposition of collagen and also deposition of fat within the muscle and within the blood vessels inside the heart. And what happens is that this leads to what's called heart failure. And heart failure is simply the heart not being able to pump enough blood around the body for the body's requirements. That's all heart failure is. And that's something that is very prevalent in our population and a very important cause of morbidity and mortality. So alongside the heart muscle ageing, of course, we also have effects on our blood vessels. So these are blood vessels in the neck, the carotid arteries, which are nice elastic arteries when we're young. As we get older, these vessels stiffen, again with collagen, but also there's deposits of fat and there's infiltration of some of our white blood cells. And these plaques become very inflamed. When they rupture, this is what causes stroke if the rupture's in a carotid artery or in a cerebral vessel in the brain. If it occurs in a coronary artery, then it's a heart attack. So the vessel becomes blocked, blood supply to the tissue is blocked, the tissue dies, and obviously there's catastrophic consequences of that. So that's the heart, that's one determinant of VO2 max. The other main determinant is muscle function, which we also study in my laboratory. In this case, you can see an individual lying on the bed here, that's his legs there. There's a bike there so that we can study the muscles under stress. This device here allows us to measure blood flow via a technique called thermodilution in the artery, and we can inject drugs into the leg as well to study various aspects of leg muscle function. We can also take little biopsies from the thigh muscles here, and that allows us to study a lot of the molecular signalling pathways in the muscles. I see people cringing there. This is done under local anaesthetic, and well, actually we anaesthetise the skin, but actually not so much the muscle, but it's a very simple procedure. And so this is what happens to our muscles with ageing. So this is an MRI picture. It's a cross-section through the thigh muscle, and you can see in this 25-year-old, nice muscle tissue here, that's the bone in the middle, very thin layer of subcutaneous fat. And what we see here is a 63-year-old, and you can see the subcutaneous fat layers quite a lot thicker. You've got some nice Wagyu beef here with marbling. You can see all the fat through there. And you can understand that this is why I can't do as many chin-ups as I could when I was 20. This is the sort of thing that will be starting to happen. So collectively, the effects of ageing usually occur, of course, in conjunction with a reduction in physical activity. Also, usually we get a little bit chubbier, and all of these things act together on muscle to promote wasting of the muscle, so the muscle cells can't renew themselves as well as we age, and this can cause frailty and what's called sarcopenia. And at the same time, the muscles don't function as well metabolically. They can't respond as well to insulin, and it means insulin can no longer be taken into the muscle tissue as well, and the glucose then stays in the vascular system, so in the blood vessels, where it can cause damage to blood vessels. So this is part of how diabetes develops. So that's enough doom and gloom, I think. What can we do about it? And is there an elixir of youth? Well, look, the first thing I'll say that is longevity is about 20 to 30% heritable. So choose your parents wisely is the first thing you can do. If you can't do that, then I guess the good news is that 70 to 80% relates to lifestyle. And in a country like Australia, that means we've actually got choice. So that's the good news, but you have to do something about it. And there's many things you can do, but I'm going to focus on one thing, and the thing that I think is most effective, but it does require dedication, and you can probably guess what it is. And it's simply this, it's be physically active. And this is a lifetime commitment, and it's something that you have to stick at and do regularly, but it has profound effects on all of these organ systems and is undoubtedly related to longer and better quality of life. If you don't believe me, I'm now going to bore you with the data. So, because this is science, right? So let me start here. This is one of the biggest epidemiological studies on physical activity. It's the Harvard Alumni study. Around 17,000 individuals, and what we're looking at here is all-cause death rates during the follow-up period of the study across different age groups. Down here we've got different levels of physical activity. These are the individuals that don't do much at all. This is the reference group. These ones do about 3 sessions a week of about 30 minutes of moderate to vigorous physical activity, and these ones do maybe 4 to 5 sessions a week, so these are doing quite a lot. If you look across all age groups, there is a dose-response relationship between exercise and all-cause death rates, and it's a really strong relationship in this older age group where, of course, we're seeing more deaths. So it's about a halving of the death rate over the follow-up of the study in this age group. But even at age 35 to 49, where there won't be many deaths at all, there's a 20% reduction in all-cause mortality rate. So really strong data. Now, the other thing I wanted to talk about, and these are more recent findings, and this relates to sitting time. There's been a lot of tension in the media on sitting time, independently of how much moderate to vigorous physical activity you might do. So in this study, again, we've got different levels of physical activity. You know, the people that are doing 5 hours or more a week, which is perhaps too extreme for most people, 4 hours, 2 hours, and less than 30 minutes. But within each of these 4 groups, we're looking at levels of sitting. So within each group, the ones on the right-hand side here are sitting for greater than 8 hours a day, so all of these ones, whereas the ones on the left are sitting for less than 4 hours a day. So you can see within each group, if you're sitting more, you've got sitting more up here, you've got a higher risk of all-cause mortality. It's really only this group that's doing 5 hours a week that can afford to sit for the rest of the day. Even if you're doing 4 hours a week, you'd be better off breaking up your sitting time. So the other advice is, apart from doing a bit of aerobic exercise, is also try to reduce your sitting time. Of course, we've sat you in a lecture theatre tonight, which is not good, but perhaps we should get up and have a wriggle round at half time. Active sitting, you can do that too. But we've done a lot of laboratory studies here to show that breaking up sitting time has a lot of beneficial effects on risk factors for diabetes and heart disease, things like blood glucose, blood pressure, etc. Now, for those of you who have never done exercise and you think it's too late, this slide is for you. So in this study, the individuals had 2 medical examinations 5 years apart, and their VO2 max was measured on 2 occasions. Those that were unfit at both examinations across all age groups had the highest all-cause death rates, it's the blue ones. Those that were fit at both examinations had the lowest death rates, but the purple ones, these are the really interesting, they were unfit and they became fit. And you can see the big reduction here in all-cause mortality rate. And Simon's just stood up, which means he's going to wind me up very soon. So I'll race forward with these couple. Just to show you that physical activity reduces the decline in VO2 max with ageing. So these are sedentary people over age from 15 up to 74, but if you're active, you can see that the line is shifted upwards. So physical activity improves VO2 max, and exercise training improves VO2 max in these individuals that are over 50. This is a postdoc in my lab. I won't go into that in detail, but I did want to show you that what this training program over 2 years did was to increase the volume of the heart. Remember I talked about ageing reducing the volume, so there's a big increase in left ventricular end diastolic volume with training, and this is because the heart has become less stiff with training. And these were middle-aged individuals where there's quite a profound effect here. And this is going to protect against heart failure. What happens to muscle strength? Well, these are untrained individuals, these are strength trained, so you can see the age-related decline here is mitigated by strength training. And if we look at the MRIs, this is a 40-year-old triathlete, a 74-year-old sedentary individual, again with the wasting and the fat, but a 70-year-old triathlete, not so different to the 40-year-old. So exercise can really retain that muscle mass and that muscle health. So what happens with ageing? We get this reduction in the number of muscle fibres, reduction in the ability of the muscle to self-renew. Exercise can revert back to the young phenotype here. It can improve the signalling in muscle and how the muscle handles insulin to prevent diabetes, and it can stimulate these mitochondrial factories in muscle which produce energy. So, I hope you agree after that, I'm sorry I rushed through it, that exercise to some extent is part of the elixir of use. There are other components too, which I haven't had time to talk about. And my overwhelming take-home message to you is if you're not physically active now, find something that works for you and do it regularly, and you'll find you look better, you feel better, and very importantly, will stave off some of these chronic diseases which are affecting our population at record levels at the moment. And the thing I haven't talked about is the brain. That's because I'm not an expert, and of course Kaarin's going to take over from here. So thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Bronwyn. So I'd now like to introduce tonight's second speaker, who's Professor Kaarin Anstey. Kaarin is a Professor of Psychology at the University of New South Wales in Sydney and the Senior Principal Research Scientist at Neuroscience Research Australia, known as NeuRA. She leads an NHMRC Centre of Research Excellence in Cognitive Health, is the Director of the NHMRC Dementia Centre for Research Collaboration and the Co-Deputy Director of the ARC Centre of Excellence in Population Ageing Research. Kaarin's research programs focus on the causes, consequences and prevention of cognitive ageing, dementia and common mental disorders in adulthood. She's worked extensively with longitudinal studies and leads the Path Through Life project, a large cohort study focusing on common mental disorders and cognitive function. Please join me in welcoming Kaarin. Thanks a lot.
Good evening, everybody, and thank you very much to the Academy for the invitation to speak to you. My talk's going to look at three questions. I'm talking about what is normal cognitive ageing, so we will touch a little bit on dementia, but the fact is that most of us actually do not develop dementia in later life. The majority of people have some cognitive decline, but that's not dementia. So I want to just explain what that is. I want to talk about how men and women differ, because it's always quite controversial looking at sex differences in these characteristics, and then look at what we can do to enhance cognitive ageing. So first of all, what is normal cognitive ageing? So as a psychologist, we look at cognitive development from birth through to death, and we really talk about two broad areas of intelligence. The first is crystallised intelligence, which is composed of verbal abilities and your professional expertise, and that tends to be something that's developed through education. It increases through the life course, and it's fairly stable unless somebody has a brain injury or a neurological disorder. On the other hand, we have a second type of intelligence that psychologists talk about, and that's fluid, and that follows neurological maturation. It's influenced by biology, disease, injury, genetics, and that does follow a maturational curve. It's similar to lung function and other biological trajectories. It tends to peak in the mid-20s, and that's why we see Nobel Prize discoveries occurring usually in the 20s. And it then is fairly stable in adulthood and starts to decline more rapidly in the 60s and 70s. And the types of abilities that we call fluid include things like mental speed, so the speed at which you process information, your reaction time, and that could be reaction time to a stimulus, for example, when you're driving, your memory, your short-term memory, and your executive function. So as psychologists, we're very interested in executive function, which is your capacity to plan ahead and to integrate complex information. And so long-term memory is often associated with verbal ability, and that's more stable. It's your short-term memory, which is fluid and which declines with ageing. So how much change is there with ageing? What does it actually look like? What I've done to illustrate the amount of change is I've taken the numbers from the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale, which is a very, very widely used assessment battery. It's used all over the world to assess cognitive abilities and intelligence, and it has norms. So it gives you the scores that the average person at a particular age has on each of the subscales of that test. So one of the tests, these are just examples. So for digits backwards, so that test asks people to see how many digits they can remember backwards in a test. And the average 25-year-old can recall 7 digits backwards. The average 65-year-old can record 5 digits backwards. So there's a loss of 2 digits over 40 years. Processing speed is something that we're very interested in, and although we do a lot of testing on computer, we still use these paper pencil tests. This is a very, very well-researched, well-understood psychological test of processing speed called the digit symbol substitution test, and what you have to do is you have to code these symbols according to the table at the top. We give the participant 90 seconds to complete this test. The average 25-year-old can complete 78 codes in 90 seconds, and the average 70-year-old can complete 51. So that just shows you what cognitive ageing is like in the population. On the other hand, vocabulary, which is crystallised, shows no change over time. If we want to convert this to IQ points, from 20 to 70, so over a period of 50 years, the average person loses 1 to 2 standard deviation of IQ points, so 15 to 30 IQ points. So there is this normal cognitive decline or normal cognitive ageing, which is not dementia. And that's what we want to focus on. So we're still interested in why this occurs and is there anything we can do to reduce cognitive decline and ultimately prevent people becoming impaired. Another characteristic of cognitive ageing that we're interested in is the fact that people become less consistent in the way that their mind works and the way they respond to tasks as they get older. So we've looked at this test. This is just using reaction time data in our cohort here in Canberra, the Path Through Life study. And we look at, if you look on the y-axis, we have variability or inconsistency in responding. And this across the top are the older adults, and they become more inconsistent over time as we study them. The younger adults are actually becoming more consistent over time on the very simple reaction time tasks. So that's just another feature that we use to understand cognitive ageing. This is another way that we look at cognition. We have longitudinal studies and we assess people multiple times, and then we statistically model the trajectories of cognitive decline. And from that, then we can add in risk factors and we look at what's moderating that slope over the life course. This is some data taken from the Victoria longitudinal study from Canada, and we could have easily created these slides on a few of the Australian studies, the Australian Longitudinal Study of Ageing, the Path Through Life project, or other studies. And this is looking at executive function, and the authors have divided their sample into groups who are ageing well and groups that aren't ageing well, and females and males. And if you look at some individuals in their sample, there are actually people who are improving in executive function even in their 60s and even in their 70s. There's even this person up here in their 90s who's still improving. The people who aren't doing so well are actually showing a decline. So we measure this in our longitudinal studies. And what we've discovered as part of our research into normal cognitive ageing is that there is a group of people that we're calling super agers, and this is being studied all over the world now, because not only are we interested in understanding what causes dementia and what the risk factors are for dementia, we want to learn from these super agers why their cognitive abilities are so good. Are there special characteristics about super agers that we could learn from? So I have a PhD student working on this at the moment, Janet Makora, and she's defined the super agers in our study, which is based on older adults here in Canberra and Queanbeyan, as people in their 60s and 70s who are performing above the average of those in their 20s. And we found that 8.6% of the females in the sample, this is on memory, 8.6% of the women in their 70s were actually in that category, and 5.3% of the men. So we see a huge variation in performance in our studies. These samples are quite big. So when I talk about the people in their 20s, we had 2,500 adults from age 20 to 24, and we had 2,500 in age 60 to 64 at baseline. So what happens in middle age in normal cognitive ageing? So cognitive ageing, we often hear about old age, and we know about children. Really not a lot happens in middle age, which is quite good because we don't want to see a decline in middle age, but it's actually understudied. So, middle-aged adults, they're too busy to often participate in research studies, and we often actually don't know enough about them. So we took a very detailed look at the middle-aged adults in our longitudinal study here in Canberra, and we looked at their cognitive change over 3 waves of data over 8 years. It was one of the few studies that's ever done this. We found that the memory actually improved in the cohort. We found verbal ability was stable, which is what we predict, and we found the cognitive slowing, which is what we would predict. When we averaged it all out, there was stability, so there was actually no overall change in cognitive function in the middle-aged adults. The adults were aged about 40 to 52 through the 8 years of follow-up. What we did find was that there was a group that had 3 or more vascular risk factors, and that group was showing cognitive decline. It wasn't bad enough to impact them in their daily activity, but it was measurable in our epidemiological study, and that's a worry for us. It's showing that the vascular risk factors are actually starting to impact cognition quite young. So do men and women differ in cognitive function? This is a really interesting topic historically because women's supposedly lower IQ and intellectual ability has been used as an excuse to prevent women from voting and prevent women from certain professions. And there's actually some quite interesting literary pieces written about women's lower intelligence by some very famous philosophers and politicians. When we look at the data, there actually are quite big sex differences. These are the data again from the Canberra Queanbeyan Path Through Life project. I've plotted, this is the 20 to 24-year-old at baseline. We've followed them for 12 years here, 4 follow-ups. This was that midlife group, and these are the older group. This is an immediate recall. So what we found was that women perform better than men on immediate recall at each wave of follow-up and in each age group. So across the board, women in our study have better memory on average. Of course, there's variation, and we have people, men with very good memory and women with poor memory. In reaction time in this middle block, we find that women are slower than men, so a higher score in reaction time is actually worse. That means that you're slower. So we find men consistently at all age groups, at all measurement occasions, better than women. In processing speed, again, we find women better than men, all follow-ups and all age groups, and verbal ability, no difference. So what we conclude, you could keep going with different tests. There are very, very reliable sex differences in cognitive abilities. Again, it washes out. On average, there's no difference overall between men and women, but there are clear strengths that men and women have when we study them reliably over time. So what can we do to enhance cognitive function as we age? When I started studying psychology at the University of Sydney in the mid-1980s, we were told that there wasn't, we were working under the assumption that the brain was fixed, you had a fixed number of neurons. When I moved into the field of cognitive ageing for my PhD, we didn't think you could do anything to reduce risk of dementia, you couldn't prevent dementia, and you couldn't modify that trajectory of cognitive ageing that we were observing in our longitudinal studies. In the last 20 years, there's been quite a revolution, and there's been a lot of work now. We're talking about preventing dementia, we're talking about risk reduction. We have the WHO guidelines, which I'm involved with developing guidelines on reducing risk of dementia. So it's now accepted that there's neuroplasticity and that we can modify that trajectory. So we have changes in the brain in structure and function that we can now measure through our imaging techniques. The morphology of neurons and tissue density we know are regionally specific, and that means that we have different patterns of ageing in different parts of the brain, with the prefrontal cortex and hippocampal atrophy, hippocampus atrophying at a faster rate, and we can see that then reflected in faster ageing of specific related cognitive abilities. And we have differences in the expression of neurotrophic factors, and that changes and reduces with age. And some of the animal literature has been very important in informing our understanding of neuroplasticity in this field and has led to us looking at a number of human and lifestyle interventions. So my work is not in animal research. I've only ever worked with humans, but it's informed by the animal literature. And some very early work that was very important across my whole field were the studies showing that rats raised in enriched environments showed more dendritic spines in the somatosensory cortex. And there's been a lot of work on animals showing that physical activity, diet, nutrition has a lot of benefits for the brain. So I'm just going to talk about cognitive enhancement, quickly mention what's shown in the animal literature, but my main interest is in human literature. It doesn't always directly translate because we are really complex and our lives are complex and the time frames are so long. So we're trying to make inferences about the impact of something over decades and decades. So something like diet, it's an exposure for 50 years, 70 years on the brain that could change over time as well. So it's very difficult doing this sort of research and controlling for all the different confounding and background variables, and animal studies are much cleaner. So from the animal literature, it's shown that cognitive exercise, it enhances neurogenesis, brain weight, and it is beneficial for brain ageing. Caloric restriction has been shown in animals to increase longevity and improve cognition. And there are some humans studies looking at caloric restriction. It's not, I don't think it would be a very popular intervention, but it is known to improve longevity, and a healthy diet, which is protective against oxidative stress. Physical activity, which we've heard about, has incredible benefits been shown time and again in animal studies that physical activity increases brain volume and stimulates neurogenesis. And the animal literature has also looked at stress reduction and shown that that's also beneficial. It's actually quite difficult to study the impact of stress on human cognitive ageing and dementia risk because everyone is stressed. Stress is a subjective experience. It's very difficult to get a control group of people who aren't stressed, very difficult to define it. There is some good research looking at Vietnam veterans showing that they have a higher risk of dementia associated with PTSD in that cohort. So we are seeing some stress come out, but it doesn't often come out in our normal cohort studies in the population. So I just want to talk about the first one of those factors, which is cognitive activity, which have been seen in the animal studies. What about in humans? And the idea of keeping your mind active or use it or lose it is actually quite old. And even Cicero talked about keeping your mind active for good ageing. So 20 years ago in the United States, a very big project was started called the ACTIVE trial, and that looked at computerised cognitive training, which was very modern at the time. And that study, it had over 1,000 participants. Some did memory training, some participants did speed of processing, and some did reasoning training, and there was a control group who did no brain training or cognitive training. And that has been followed up, that sample. It's the most definitive study ever conducted of cognitive training, and they did find that the people that did their cognitive training intervention have had less cognitive decline. They've reported that multiple times at different follow-ups, and they also had better daily function. They drove for longer, they've had fewer crashes, car crashes, and they have better instrumental activities of daily living, so they're managing their lives better. The training period only went for 5 weeks, it was twice a week, but they did have booster sessions. And last year they even published findings showing that the group that had the processing speed training had a reduced risk of dementia. So it's a very important study. It's quite different from the brain training that you'll see online, the brain training packages. This training involved a research assistant sitting with the person, they came into the lab. They had a whole intervention, they were part of a study, they had to join up, they had to fill in questionnaires. So often it's difficult to isolate what was actually the special ingredient there. Was it just the computerised training, or was it actually being part of this very stimulating and exciting study? We've also looked at cohort studies, and we found that a cognitively engaged lifestyle is neuroprotective and reduces the risk of dementia, and this has been shown multiple times now. And when we talk about a cognitively engaged lifestyle, it is something that all of us can do. It means things like reading, going to the theatre, museums, coming to talks like this one. It's being mentally stimulated, but particularly undertaking something that's challenging to you personally. So whether that's a U3A course, learning a language, learning a new instrument, it's being cognitively engaged. And there's a lot of epidemiological data now showing that that's associated with reduced risk of dementia. There is a slight issue that when people become cognitively impaired, they do withdraw from their daily activities, so there is some element of reverse causation that we've been trying to tease out. Nevertheless, the weight of the evidence at the moment is in favour of it being protective. There's also neuroimaging studies where they've done brain training and that's shown changes on MRI, pre and post memory training. There's examples of the London taxi drivers who have an increased hippocampal volume compared to the London bus drivers because the taxi drivers have to learn the knowledge. So there's a number of other forms of evidence that we can use to pull together to really support this view of cognitively engaged lifestyle being neuroprotective. Now I want to talk about diet. Diet's something that everybody has an opinion about. It's really fascinating. It's culturally determined as well. And we've looked at this a lot in our Australian data, and it's very well researched overseas. And the diet that's been looked at the most is the Mediterranean diet. So the meta-analysis has shown that people who adhere to a Mediterranean dietary pattern have a 33% reduced risk of mild cognitive impairment and Alzheimer's disease. So in these studies, they get people to fill in food frequency questionnaires, and then they code up the questionnaire according to different dietary patterns. There's a second diet that's relevant, and that's called the DASH diet, the Dietary Approaches to Stop Hypertension. I think that's put up by the US Heart Association, and that's also been shown to be protective against cognitive decline. So just go back to the Medi diet, it's high in fruit and vegetables, it uses olive oil as the main oil, and includes wine regularly with meals, and it includes fish, and is light on meat and processed foods. We've looked at diet in our cohort study here in Canberra, and we looked at diet in relation to brain, and we found that people that had a dietary pattern that had lots of meat, potatoes and soft drinks showed more hippocampal volume shrinkage over 4 years than people who had a healthy diet. And we've also looked at the Mediterranean diet in our study in Australia. We've looked at it in the AusDiet project, which is a national study, and we've looked at it in the PASS study. We didn't find Medi-protective, unfortunately. But we have been looking at this new MIND diet, which is more specific than Medi. I think often with these studies, it depends on your comparison group. So if your comparison group have a really, really unhealthy diet, you've obviously got a stronger chance of having a significant effect. This diet is really a combination of the MIND and the DASH diets. It's developed by Martha Morris from New York. She's scientifically analysed all the nutrients and their potential for neuroprotection, and she's analysed a lot of data sets and shown that the MIND dietary pattern is associated with reduced risk of dementia and reduced risk of Alzheimer's pathology on neuroimaging scans. The characteristics of this diet that differ from the Mediterranean diet are that it requires you to eat green leafy vegetables every day and to eat berries regularly. It includes olive oil as the main oil and has nuts and fish and wine. Wine down here. A quick comment on alcohol. We have shown that light to moderate drinking is associated with reduced risk of dementia. This has been shown over and over again in all the meta-analyses. It's quite controversial, however. It's unclear if drinking is protective purely or if abstainers who don't drink actually are at increased risk for other reasons. And because this is always observational research, you can never tell from cohort studies what the true association is. Very heavy drinking can lead to alcohol dementia, and alcohol consumption also increases the risk of some cancers. So what we say is to really consider the overall health risks and follow the national guidelines, which are no more than 2 drinks a day. I think I'm going to skip through physical activity very quickly because I'm nearly at the end of my time. It has multiple benefits, lots of mechanisms. Basically, the message that's coming out from the trials of physical activity is that the combination of resistance training and aerobic training is shown to be most beneficial for brain health. That's the only combination that's really showing a benefit for memory in the randomised controlled trials. The physical activity literature is quite controversial. I don't know if you've heard different things in the media with different studies published recently. Some studies have not shown a benefit. I think that's probably a good topic for discussion, but I think it shows the importance of good science in this area. And so I just want to conclude by saying normal cognitive ageing will be the experience of the majority, not dementia, and dementia is another whole conversation. There is a large individual variation in how we age cognitively. Neuroplasticity enables the modification of the trajectories that we're on, and there is quite a lot we can do. As Bronwyn's already pointed out, it also applies to brain health, and we can change the trajectory that we're on through lifestyle. But the recommendations need to be based on research, and it's very important that we have good science underpinning any of the recommendations that we make. Thank you.
Kaarin, thanks very much for that. Now we've got time for some questions. Bronwyn, would you like to come up? We've got 2 roving microphones, and we have a microphone at the back on the top deck. So, you should have microphones here, at least one. I thought there was another one. We have 2. Okay, questions?
One here.
Yes, go for it.
Oh, good evening. Thank you very much. Professor Kingwell, I work in Chinese medicine. I was just wondering if you're aware of any evidence about the value of Tai Chi and Qigong regularly as exercise.
Look, I'm not aware of actually any specific studies. You may know better than me. There have been some randomised trials performed, I know, but I'm not across that literature. Certainly all the different types of exercise can have different effects on some of the organ systems that I discussed, and a lot of the strength and balance type aspects that I talked about are likely to be affected by Tai Chi, but I'm not across the literature, unfortunately.
Yes.
Thank you. Professor, sorry, what's your name? Yeah, Bronwyn. Sorry, I was just, having gone from being a person that's been very sedentary to now looking seriously at my health in middle age, I would love to have aspired to being able to do one pull up one chin up when I was 20. It's not going to happen. I was wondering whether, the much touted 10,000 steps per day, whether that is considered sufficient exercise, or do you really need to look at the benefits coming from being quite sedentary to working out at a gym several times a week? I'm just wondering what is considered a minimum adequate regular exercise.
I don't think there's any minimum, actually. I think, that's a cute public health message which works, and it's a continuum like most things, so anything's better than nothing. A lot of the cardiovascular risk factors like blood pressure and so forth do tend to, well, they're impacted at different thresholds, but the sort of 30 minutes, 3 times a week of moderate to vigorous physical activity, so some, uphill walking, that type of thing, will give you a good level of fitness and also some benefits on those types of cardiovascular risk factors. And if you can do a little bit of strength training as well, that just builds muscle, which increases metabolism and makes the risk of diabetes reduce substantially. So it's a little bit of everything, but you've got to start gradually and build up, and most importantly, try and find something that you enjoy, because you just won't do it otherwise. So it's lots of little decisions that you have to make every single day. Take the stairs, not the lift, all those types of things. All makes a difference.
Okay.
To Dr. Anstey, Professor Kingwell mentioned the sort of recovery that can occur with exercise in the physical side. Do any of the factors, diet, exercise, show any kind of recovery on the intellectual, the brain function side? Does that make any sense?
Yeah. So what we see with the cognitive training is that recovery, people can improve their cognitive abilities in the area in which they're trained. We're having trouble finding transfer to other abilities in daily life. And also in some of the research, we've seen improvements in cognitive function with physical activity over time in the randomised controlled trials. Improvements in processing speed, reaction time and executive function.
Thanks very much for that talk. Do you understand the chemical basis for ageing? And if you understand the chemical basis, there's always a possibility of working out some sort of elixir. Now, where are you going with that?
That's a good question. So the way that I'd interpret the chemical basis is understanding a lot of the molecular pathways, and we are starting to understand them. So, for example, in muscle ageing, there's a decline in the ability of the muscles to regenerate. There's a decline in the mitochondria, those factories that produce energy, and there's a great deal of research effort at the moment into increasing the function of those types of organs, and there's lots of interesting targets. None of them have translated at this stage to therapeutics, but there's certainly a lot in the pipeline. Another example would be in glucose metabolism. So by understanding what exercise does to some of the glucose pathways in muscle, we can find ways to target them with drugs and actually reverse some of the changes that we know occur with ageing. So a lot of research, but nothing that's translated on that side at present. I don't know, Kaarin, if you want to comment in the cognitive space, but yeah, that's exactly where it's going.
Okay.
Hello, thank you for the wonderful talk. They were both excellent. I have a question probably relating genetic factors to lifestyle factors. So with diseases such as Alzheimer's, we have seen genetic markers as well as lifestyle choices and factors which may influence our development of these diseases. To what extent do you both think that changing lifestyle factors can preempt genetic fate?
$1 million question. Just all I can talk about is the data that we have. We've looked at this in our PATH cohort. We computed a polygenic risk score for Alzheimer's disease, and we looked at how well that predicted the development of mild cognitive impairment and dementia compared to a risk score that was comprised of things like diabetes, hypertension, sedentary lifestyle, obesity, head injury, so all of the medical and lifestyle risk factors, and smoking. And we actually found that the lifestyle risk factors explain more variance and were more predictive. So in the population, which is not, it includes people without Alzheimer's as well, in just across the general population, we're finding lifestyle more predictive, but the polygenic risk score was also predictive.
I'd add to that too, with whatever genetic hand you're dealt, there's no doubt that by having a healthy lifestyle, you're going to improve your outcome, you know, on whatever basis that genetics is.
I was interested in Professor Kingwell's the graph showing decline in morbidity, mortality as people increase their physical activity, and in particular that people can get from unfit to fit even if they're old. Does that ability to get fit, does that even apply to people who already have heart failure?
Yes, it does. There's very good evidence of training studies in individuals with different types of heart disease, including heart failure and coronary heart disease, that training programs work. They can improve the VO2 max parameter that I talked about, improve cardiac function and improve outcome. Cardiac rehabilitation is a very big part of recovery after a heart attack or an infarction and has very good benefits. Which, you know, a very important part of rehab in addition to drugs.
Yes.
Could I ask about bone health as you get older? Nobody mentioned bones and bone strength.
Yes, that's probably because it's not our expertise, but there's certainly known to be bone loss with ageing, and from an exercise perspective, weight-bearing exercise in particular can help to maintain bone mass with ageing and reduce some of the frailty associated with bone loss. I don't know, Kaarin, if you want to comment further, or Simon?
Just a general point that there's some theories of ageing that look at all the body systems together, and if you start to have too much bone loss, you can't exercise, and it has other compounding. You have an increased risk of fracture, then that again means that you can't exercise, that's bad for your brain, increases your risk of dementia. So all of these things are intercorrelated.
I'm interested in the question of transferable skills. It's been a great matter of debate in education for a long time. But with ageing, for example, if I play bridge 3 times a week, does that improve my ability to learn French?
That's a fantastic question. The short answer is no. In that the training is usually quite specific. There are some general skills. So the reason that active trial we think was so effective was that it trained processing speed. And processing speed is actually a fundamental cognitive ability that's used for a lot of other cognitive tasks. So it's much more likely to transfer. But playing bridge is quite a specific skill. It might be improving memory. There might be some particular things in the task that could transfer, but in general, no. So if we want to have a general transfer effect, we'd be trying to train the more generic cognitive abilities. But we're also looking in some of our other research at actually training particular skills that older adults need to have a good quality of life. So we've just completed a trial and published that looking at training people on driving skills. So we do an analysis, identify specific errors that older drivers are making, we implement a training program, and we've reduced critical errors, and we've moved people from unsafe to safe by just targeting the things that need fixing.
So we've probably got time for one more question at the back.
Thank you. A lot of people, we often think of ourselves as either having a glass half full or a glass half empty view of life. My impression tonight of the audience here is that most of us seem to have a glass half full look. I just wonder, when you're looking at different studies that you've undertaken, how do you mask against that? Do you in fact find many of your participants actually have the glass half full attitude all the time?
It's a hard one. Are you talking about response bias in the participants?
Yes, I was thinking of that. I'm also mindful of the fact that people who do have an optimistic view of life seem to just have more bounce to them.
Yeah, actually we have done some research on looking at expectations about ageing. So we've looked at this in the Australian Longitudinal Study of Ageing, and we found that people that have a better expectation about their own ageing and the ageing of others actually live longer and have less depression. And a colleague at Yale has looked at this in terms of recovery from heart attack and shown that people that have more positive age stereotypes and expectations about their health and ageing actually have better recovery. So it is a bit like fulfilling your expectations, and we think it is good to have a very optimistic outlook on ageing.
Okay, so thank you all for your questions. They were all fascinating. And let's just put our hands together and thank Kaarin and Bronwyn. And just look out for the next one, which is, does anybody know when the next one is? 11th of December. So looking forward to seeing you all here then.